Good evening, and welcome to the Chatham Marconi Speaker Series. My name is Liz McCart, and I'm a volunteer here at the center. We are so pleased that you have joined us tonight and look forward to our program. Our wireless world is ever changing, and information technology security is also rapidly changing. Tonight's speaker, Jeremy Rasmussen, is a cybersecurity expert and will provide his perspective on this complex environment. As a reminder, you can pose your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen during the program, and we will have Jeremy answer as many questions at the end of the program as possible. It is now my privilege to introduce Jeremy. Jeremy
Thanks,
is
Liz.
You're welcome.
Oh.
Welcome. Jeremy is the
Go
Chief
ahead.
Technology Officer and Chief Information Security Officer at Abacode, a Florida-based company providing managed cybersecurity and compliance programs in businesses all across industries. He's also an adjunct professor of cybersecurity at the University of South Florida. For nearly 30 years, he has performed research and development of cyber solutions and built cyber services teams for the government and for commercial customers. Jeremy graduated from college with a Bachelor of Science degree in computer science and holds a master's degree in engineering management, both from the University of South Florida. Jeremy is also a certified CISSP and a white hat ethical hacker, which I'm sure he will explain what that means. So Jeremy, I will now turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks again, Liz. Let me share some slides with you. Can you see that okay, Liz?
We're seeing the notes too.
Okay, we don't want to see that then.
Yep.
You know, you can prepare 10 times over and things don't always go exactly as scheduled, but how about now?
There we go. That's great. Thanks. That's good.
So yeah, tonight's topic is looking at the changing cybersecurity threatscape. So a threatscape is as you can imagine, the things which we have to worry about. And certainly I could have just picked out a vulnerability of the week. You might have read in the news, or if you're involved with computing or IT security, Log4j came out a few weeks ago. It was a vulnerability where any kind of Apache server that was running Java had a audit log function in it, and you could manipulate the function to not just write strings of text to a log file. You could actually get it to execute malicious code. So it was fairly easy to exploit, trivial to exploit actually, and very widespread. It was involved in millions of computers around the world. And so everybody had to spring into action to, figure out what was going on there. But that, I'm not just going to be, talking about that type of thing. I'm actually going to be talking about the bigger picture. Why are these issues so critical now? What has changed over the last few years to make them, to make the attack surface bigger, and what can we do about it? So as mentioned, I'm the CTO of Abacode. It's a company in Tampa, Florida, that does manage cybersecurity and compliance programs. So a lot of small to mid-sized businesses simply can't find the people. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the budget to hire, dedicated cybersecurity analysts and experts to run a proper program for their company. And yet it's absolutely critical in this day and age to have to align with a best practices framework for cybersecurity. It's how you protect your data, the personally identifiable information of your employees and customers, intellectual property, financial transactions, and so forth. These are the things that keep you afloat in business. And so if you're not protecting those things, you're definitely at risk. So as I mentioned, a lot of companies simply just can't afford it or think they can't afford it, but we can do a managed program as an outsourced third party, which is usually within the budget of companies. So that's our value proposition. So what are we going to talk about tonight? Well, first, taking a look at before COVID and after COVID, what is the IT infrastructure, big picture look like? We'll also talk about the fact that even cryptographically signed software, which means it's saying that it's from, it's trusted software from a vendor, we can't trust it anymore. And then the perhaps surprising way in which most attackers are gaining access to systems. Maybe you won't be surprised at all by that. We'll talk about an emerging threat, which is web and SSL virtual private network vulnerabilities in firewalls. Talk a little bit about some of the emerging security issues with mobile 5G and ubiquitous wireless. We'll see what is the big deal with artificial intelligence, machine learning in cybersecurity. And then we'll talk about what should any company be doing if they want to, any organization, I should say, to protect its critical data. At the end, as time permits, we'll open it up to questions. And Liz is going to help me collect those, I guess, through the Q&A function of Zoom. All right, so just taking a look here. Back in the day, the traditional view is that you had this castle, this fortress you had to guard, and just like you think of a castle has a walls and a moat and everything, and it's this monolithic entity, and you just have to make sure that you pull the drawbridge up and you make sure that they can't scale the walls. That's how we thought of IT infrastructure back in the day, where you have this well-defined perimeter. Everything traverses through a firewall, and as long as the firewall rules are good, and maybe you have some antivirus on your PCs and endpoints to make sure if somebody opens a malicious attachment in an email, or somebody brings in a thumb drive or something, that it's not going to infect the whole network. But those are the basic problems you had to worry about. Well, as we know, that kind of situation has been going away since the early 2000s with the advent of cloud computing. Now you're talking about not a well-defined perimeter. You're talking about most of your users, especially within the last few years with COVID and work from home, everybody's remote now. So you're outside the protected perimeter. You're connecting through things like this, like Zoom meetings and GoToMeeting. And you have to have some way to keep tabs on these devices. There's a lot of BYOD, which is bring your own device, right? People are connecting with home computers. Well, all of these things present a risk to a corporate network. And so we have to, figure out ways to come up with new security configuration policies to address these challenges. The key way probably that people are talking about these days is called zero trust. A zero trust architecture means essentially assume somebody's already inside your environment. I know this sounds like a defeatist kind of point of view, but this is the new normal. When the Navy builds ships, they build them so that they can get from one port to another, even if they spring a leak, right? They can cordon off those bulkheads or whatever to make sure that the thing is not going to go to the bottom. You don't want to be like the Titanic, right? If you spring a leak, you still got to get to where you're going. Well, that's the kind of new normal for network security as well. Assume somebody might be already inside your network. How do you keep them from getting to anything important? Well, that's going to be through several factors. What we call zero trust is micro-segmentation, which means just because they can get into one part of the network does not mean they can traverse from there into another part of the network where they might be able to access critical data. We want to add on single sign-on and multi-factor authentication everywhere. What does that mean? It means you want to have some sort of software solution that's going to allow them to authenticate, and then for each application they needed to get into, they're going to have a different authentication method, another password, if you will. And multi-factor authentication means they don't just have to have a password, they have to have 2 factors at least. So say maybe user ID and password, and then something perhaps on your phone that they open an app and they have to type in a code, or they have to say yes to a positive checkoff, challenge and response type thing. You need to have endpoint detection and response and managed detection and response agents and monitoring capability everywhere. We'll talk about that a little bit later, which means visibility into what's going on. So an agent on a laptop device or in some kind of endpoint is going to be something that's going to report back things happening at the host or operating system level back to a main console. There's also going to be, you want to be pulling logs from your firewall and other network infrastructure as well. And we'll talk about that, the idea of extensible detection and response and security information event management. But this is absolutely critical for a zero trust architecture. And also helping to bring what I would call shadow IT under centralized visibility control. So you have operational technology, you have what's called the Internet of Things. These are all embedded systems that are out there. So imagine like a manufacturing production floor is going to have embedded computers that run the equipment. At a water treatment facility, you're going to have industrial control systems. They're going to be, checking the sodium hydroxide levels of the water and things like that. You're going to have even cloud and social media. Like, you can't imagine how much of an organization is run on social media these days. You use LinkedIn for HR and hiring. We use Twitter for help desk support, and you use Instagram for public relations. So those things have to be under centralized IT visibility control, and you have to assume always if somebody's trying to get in those systems, they're trying to clone the systems, they're trying to bypass the systems, security. There's fraudulent activity everywhere. This is not a new concept. The idea of zero trust is well publicized now, and even the federal government is talking about it extensively, as early as about 3 or 4 years ago. And now I'm not going to give them any credit. This contractor just got a new award from the DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency, for a zero trust program called Thunderdome. It's the first of a program for developing a kind of a pilot for zero trust in the DoD, as coming out of the mandated cybersecurity executive order that was issued by the Biden administration last May. So this is not just me saying you need zero trust. The federal government is saying it as well. All right, so let's talk about this idea about trusted software. And if you run, like right now, I'm running a Mac computer, but I'm running PowerPoint on it. So I trust Microsoft Office 365 to do its job and not to harm me. But I'm putting some implicit trust in them, which what is my basis for that? Well, one of the things that companies can do is apply what's called a cryptographic signature to software. And when it's deployed to your system, you'll run a signature verification to make sure that it's really coming from them and it's not a Trojan horse looking to attack you. But what if that software itself has been backdoored, has been Trojanized by an attacker? This is exactly what happened in 2020. SolarWinds is software which does network health and status monitoring, and it's used all over the world. They have tens of thousands of customers, and they found out that there was this. What happened was a company called FireEye, which is a cybersecurity intrusion detection company, figured out that they had been compromised and that somebody had stolen their penetration testing ethical hacking tools. how did they get it? How did they get in and get those tools? Well, they figured out ultimately that it was through SolarWinds, which they were using in their own network. And then they dug in deeper and figured out that SolarWinds had a compromise in their software development process, what they call DevOps process, such that some kind of Trojan horse was inserted into the software build process itself. And when they were building the Orion software, which is the updates for the SolarWinds network software, it had a backdoor in there which would send out these malicious software downloads. So Sunburst was one that would allow the attacker, it would sit quietly for a few weeks, like dormant, not do anything, so that you would just kind of forget about it. And then ultimately it would start doing command and control type things where it would connect out to a remote host. It would try to then collect data about the inside of the environment. It would try to drop what's called a exploit framework, such as Cobalt Strike. It would take many more hours to go into all the details of these attacks, but suffice it to say, Cobalt Strike is a tool that we use as ethical pen testers. People hire us to come, hack into their networks and show them all the flaws and how to fix them. So an exploit framework is one in which our penetration testing team will use this software to probe for vulnerabilities, exploit them, and then leverage those vulnerabilities to, move laterally within the organization, pivot to other systems, escalate privileges, gather passwords, and so forth. So Cobalt Strike is legitimate software. Now, this is probably a hacked version of it, a pirated version that they use. And so maybe you could say, why wouldn't they just, I guess if you're looking to detect the signature of such an attack, you just detect for Cobalt Strike being used in your organization. But they might have, built a custom version of it that would evade detection. I don't know. I'm speculating there. Long and short, this went out to 18,000 customers of SolarWinds. So 18,000 customers, including the federal government and including a number of Fortune 500 companies, were exploited through the use of this tool. We think it happened through the Russian, the Russian government. We don't have any, direct proof of that, but that's, we've made those charges and accusations. My question is, what was the initial vector of attack? APT is an acronym for Advanced Persistent Threat, and that's what we call these nation-state attacks, where they try to gain a foothold and exploit that for a long time, over time. And my question is, how did they initially get into the back door of the DevOps process at SolarWinds to be able to Trojanize the software? I don't have a good answer for that, but I have a question for you, the audience. What do you think is the vector that's most often utilized for spreading ransomware? I'll give you three choices here. Is it service misconfiguration, B, phishing and social engineering, or C, remote desktop misconfiguration? So I don't have, I'm not looking at my chat right now, but, or don't know if we have chat available, but I'll assume most people, because I've done this poll before, most every time people assume it's B, phishing and social engineering. They assume that humans are the weakest link, and therefore that's must be the way they're getting in most often. But as it turns out, it's actually remote desktop misconfiguration. Ransomware spreads most often through this vector. Now, phishing and social engineering is still an issue, and it's good to train people so that they can be, empowered to be the first line of defense against these attacks. But if you talk about remote desktop, some months ago, I think it was last year during the Super Bowl, we just heard that Tom Brady's retiring, so that's bad news for us. You guys probably don't, feel too sorry for us since we took your quarterback, and he led us to the Super Bowl last year. But right about the Super Bowl weekend, somebody was working at the Oldsmar water supply desk overnight. Oldsmar is a little city at the northern end of Tampa Bay, and they saw their mouse moving on their screen, and they saw somebody go into the water supply controls and change the sodium hydroxide levels to 100 times normal. They were trying to poison the water supply. How had they gotten in? They came in through what's called TeamViewer, which is remote access software. And they had, unfortunately, didn't have very good security controls there in place, and they had reused a password. So that people can either do what's called brute force password guessing. They could just try every combination until they get it right. And if you don't have any kind of lockout or timeout, they can just keep going and trying until they get the right one forever. Or they could do what's called credential stuffing, where people tend to reuse passwords because they have so many to remember these days. I probably have 100 different accounts. And if I didn't have any kind of password manager, I would have to come up with an individual password for all those accounts. And inevitably, you're going to repeat one. So other systems that have been attacked and compromised, such as Yahoo Mail and LinkedIn and all these others attacks, the passwords associated with the email accounts in those attacks are out there for everybody to find on the dark web. And the attackers will go steal these, they'll retry them, and sometimes they get lucky and they work. So that's probably what happened with the Oldsmar water supply. But that is most often, the abused way of getting into these systems. And these ransomware guys, like Maze Ransomware is a very popular ransomware group that's been out there for a few years. I say they're such a pain in the you-know-what because they're very good business people. They have come up with, used to be they would just encrypt all your files and charge you a ransom to get a decrypt key to decrypt the files. But now, if you don't pay them, they'll threaten to dox you, which means they'll put all your private data out there on the web. They'll embarrass you. They'll go out and talk to your customers. We've seen this before, where a victim will see that the ransomware group has emailed all of their customers and said, you know what, these guys got hit with ransomware, and we were able to get your private data. So they're not a very good company. And they'll threaten you that way. So they also have these affiliate programs where they have a separation of duties. They'll go hire a professional pen testing team, what they call a red team, just like my company does, but we're on the good guy side. They'll hire the black hatters who will go in and they'll get an initial foothold in a system, and they'll sell access back to the ransomware group, which will then load its malicious software, encrypt all the files, and charge the ransom to get them decrypted. It's crazy. The thing we're trying to do here is understand the tools, techniques, and practices, or TTPs, of our adversaries. And they don't actually, it's not novel. They kind of run the same way every time. They try to get a foothold in your environment through remote desktop misconfiguration, missing patch, or phishing, social engineering somebody. Once they get in there, they're going to try to establish persistence, which is a backdoor for later. By the way, these teams from the ransomware groups, once they get access through a vulnerability, they tend to patch and close the vulnerability because they don't want anybody else coming in the same way. They want to own that system for themselves and be able to do what they want. But they definitely will create some kind of account or way that they can get in easily later. They're going to try to escalate privileges because they don't want to just be a regular user. They want to be the administrator or root level operator. They're going to shut down your antivirus or endpoint protection. They're going to try to scrape passwords anywhere they can find them. There's different places you can try to find passwords and crack those. They're going to discover what the network looks like. They're going to try to move laterally within the network and collect any kind of important information. They're going to establish command and control out to a third-party site, as I mentioned. On the right-hand side, I have, how Maze Ransomware does all those things. They set up a batch file in your startup folder for persistence. They disable your dynamic analysis tools. They use a tool called Mimikatz to find passwords and grab a copy of the security administration database. They execute PSExec and PowerShell, which are system administration tools that are useful. I mean, those are tools that anybody uses if you're administering Windows computers, but they're going to use those to move from one machine to another. They have they connect out to command and control sites in Russia. They're very clever at hiding their traffic by interleaving web traffic with other. It looks like just regular web traffic, so it's hard to pick up on and see that it's an attack going on. For collection and exfiltration of important data, you're always going to find, a copy of 7-zip, which they use to archive files and compress them and encrypt them, and then WinSCP for FTPing those up to the cloud. Down at the impact level, that's where you never want to be, because that means bad things are happening. They're going to delete your shadow volume. So in Windows, you have this capability of creating restore images. So like, have you ever had the blue screen of death after you installed a new program? There's a way to roll that back. You can go back to a snapshot of the system before you install the program, and hopefully you can recover without blue screening again. Well, they'll disable that service and delete the backup copies. So now there's no way, once they encrypt everything, to go back to what you had. The only way you can recover is if you had a separate backup copy, either on a disk, a third-party disk, or in a cloud to do the recovery. They're also going to stop your database server and again encrypt all your files. So what we can do is we can look for all those indicators of compromise associated with the cyber kill chain through what's called a SIEM, a security information and event management solution. There's also the emerging tool called XDR, extensible detection response. So in our case, our company has people watching the matrix, if you will, 24/7 around the clock from Tampa and Las Vegas. We have a SIEM which aggregates log data from your firewall, your endpoints, your virtualization software, your cloud, anything on premises, Office 365, Google Workspaces, and all that. It runs something like 30,000 pre-configured correlation rules over that data to look for indicators of compromise, these very things that we were talking about back here. If we see, and the idea is we want to get it up at the top of the kill chain at the initial access, execution, persistence phase. If it's all the way down to the exfiltration and impact phase, it's almost too late, right? We want to get we want to see those indicators as early as possible and be able to step in and stop them in near real time. Okay, and if you don't have this kind of visibility, I really think you're flying blind. I don't see how you can stop cyber threats at all in your organization. Let's liken this to physical security. If you had like a warehouse and you wanted to make sure people weren't coming in and stealing things from your warehouse, you would have to have a camera system. First of all, you're going to have locks on the doors and alarms, but you also have to have a camera system. But you also have to have somebody watching the camera system. And if they see somebody coming in, they do something about it. They have a response. They call the police or whatever. In the same way, you have to have both the SIEM in place watching for indicators of compromise and the people to do the escalations and response. If you don't have both of those factors, then you're just flying blind, as I mentioned. All right, moving along. One of the other scary things we've seen out there of late, and by the way, maybe if as time permits, or I can provide these through Liz later on, I've written blog posts on many of these topics I'm covering tonight, and if you want to read more about them, I can provide links to those blog posts, and you can see a lot more detailed information on each of these things. All right, so I was talking to Liz earlier and talking about how I go out to a conference in Las Vegas every year called DEF CON. It's 25,000 hackers that descend on Las Vegas, and we share, ideas. You've got white hatters, which are the ethical hackers. You've got the black hatters, which are the bad guys, and you've got feds. You've got you got everybody. You don't really know who's who. You're just kind of rubbing elbows and exchanging ideas. So it's a really interesting melange of people out there. One of the things they have every year is called the Capture the Flag competition, where they have these vulnerable systems, and you're trying to exploit them, gain a flag, and score points to win the prize. One of the greatest hackers right now, who's kind of turned his capture the flag prowess into money by participating in what they call bug bounty programs. So, Google, Apple, all these companies, Microsoft, will give you money if you find a critical flaw, a security flaw in their program, and ethically disclose that to them so they can fix it before it becomes a big issue. They'll actually pay you money. I have a friend who made $100,000 off of a critical flaw from Apple last year. Well, this guy, Orange Tsai and Met Chang from Taiwan, do a lot of capture the flag playing, and they also won the Pwn to Own championship. So there's a conference in Vancouver called CanSec West every year that if you come in there and you show that you can exploit, let's just say, a 0-day vulnerability, which means something that nobody's ever seen before and there's no patch for it. If you can exploit a 0-day in, say, the Google Chrome browser, and you can demonstrate this in real time, they'll give you money on the spot. So these folks are doing that every day, all day. They're having fun, but making lots of money off of it. And again, they're the good guys. They are ethically disclosing these vulnerabilities to the vendors so that they can be fixed. Well, they figured out that all of these firewalls, FortiGate, Cisco, Palo Alto, all of them have some sort of web-based interface to allow them to be accessed by an administrator over the internet. Not a great idea, because you're basically opening up a new attack surface that somebody can come in and bypass your firewall and exploit it. Unfortunately, they found out that many of these firewall web interfaces were based on old code from like Apache Linux, web server. And for example, the SSL VPN for FortiGate is found on nearly 500,000 servers all over the country, including, here's a couple. Twitter has a VPN access portal. Marvel Comics has a VPN access portal. You can find these VPN access portals all over, and they're fairly vulnerable. How do they do it? Without getting into too much detail, they treated it like a capture the flag challenge. They saw the software code for FortiGate as just this binary program. They figured out how to mount it, how to get into a shell, and then start exploring in it as if you were on a Unix or Linux system. They were able to land what's called a buffer overflow. Boy, again, it would take a couple of days probably for me to explain all this to the audience, but if you have a program and it's expecting a certain amount of data to be input, and you put too much data in, you can overflow the input buffer. And in some cases, that allows you to actually overwrite security sensitive variables in the program, and allows you to redirect program flow and to execute your own code. So amazingly, they were able to do this with many of these web VPN vulnerability, firewall across multiple different vendors. Okay. So bottom line is, I recommend don't running a SSL VPN at all if you have a firewall, unless you absolutely must. And if you are going to run it, there is some guidance from our National Institute of Standards and Technology under publication, special publication 800-113 will tell you how to run that securely. But if you don't absolutely need it, I would say disable that on your firewall. If we have any IT people here, any security people, this is a scary area that I recommend disabling that SSL VPN. Moving along, I've added this in. I've given previous version of this talk. One of the classes I teach at the university is mobile and wireless security. And this is something that keeps me up at night, is the proliferation of wireless networks and wireless technology and high speed, high data throughput capability, because of what are the implications of that from a security standpoint. So if you recall, back in 2G, it's where we first started having data being sent. So what, first generation 1G was just voice, and can't even remember if we had SMS text messaging then. 2G is when we started to have data, and it's also where hackers started figuring out how to compromise the networks by, for example, you would always connect to the strongest signal, so they could just put up a fake, antenna in a nanocell, picocell, and you would connect to their antenna, and they could actually tell you to downgrade encryption and steal your MZ identifier for your phone, things like that. Those issues were addressed in 3G and 4G, and hopefully now that we're into 5G, there's even more security things in place for these standards, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But it still scares me for a couple of other reasons. Oh yeah, so I forgot I had this slide. This is there was no data transfer in the original cellular technologies of 1G in the 80s. 2G is where we had connections of up to 40 kilobits per second. 3G 21.6. 4G, which is where where we are a lot of places still right now, which has been around since 2008, 1 gig. And then 5G, we're talking about the potential for 20 gigabyte per second, gigabit per second, I should say, throughput. That's from a static transmission standpoint. Probably if you're moving, you're never going to get that type of throughput. But long and short is, the global demand for traffic hit 38 exabytes of data being sent per month in 2019, and they're predicting 160 exabytes per month will be needed by 2025. I mean, an exabyte, if a gigabyte is 10 to the 9 bytes, an exabyte is 1 quintillion bytes or 10 to the 18 bytes. So that is a lot. What I'm worried about there is these embedded sensors everywhere. I'm really worried from a privacy standpoint, right? Ubiquitous wireless means they could put sensors, little cameras, little detection things everywhere. And it's just, there's two things there. It's a privacy concern, but it's also more attack surfaces. You may have read about this a few years back. Attackers were able to take over a certain type of webcam because it didn't have adequate security protections in it. And they were able to create a denial of service attack against a web services provider that ended up slowing down. It was part of a larger attack, but I think they had some 50,000 or more webcams involved in creating this malicious traffic to try to bring down these certain websites. And it affected, Amazon and eBay and Twitter and Facebook were slowed down or stopped for hours at a time because of these Internet of Things devices being brought in on the attack. So it's more attack surfaces. There's also this issue of these devices don't have much in the way of interface on them. They don't have a keyboard, a monitor. They don't have a lot of processing power, data, and so they're connecting up to the cloud to do their activities, right? So now you're creating new, millions of new interface connections to the cloud. Again, that's just more threat surface, more attack surface to be worried about. I'm probably way over my head on a lot of this stuff because I'm not a electrical engineer, but as I understand it, there's several different flavors. There's 3 different bands based on their frequencies. So the millimeter wave is the fastest, but very short range. I know that one of my customers is a professional sports team with a sports venue, and AT&T recently put in a new millimeter wave system there, which is awesome because now even if there's 25,000 people in this arena, everybody can connect to the cellular data with no degradation in service. But it's only it's good for a large venue, but you can't. It's not going to go very far. Midband is the most widely deployed form, which is going to be the towers and everything. Low band is the one which is very long wavelengths, not very fast, not a lot of data being sent, but it's very good for maybe low power IoT devices and things like that. That's the one I think people are nervous about, the low band, because they're like, what are they're worried about the maybe the health implications. I don't know. You'll have to read about that. But what keeps me up at night is the things that I might worry most about it from a security standpoint would be risks inherent to the 5G technology. So has anybody figured out how to break some of these protocols yet? Well, like I said, we did in the past in 2G and 3G, not as much. I haven't seen a lot of papers or exploitation being talked about at these conferences for 5G as yet. That doesn't mean it's there. They actually did. They talked about the evolved endpoint node and multi-factor authentication. On these things are inherent to the standard now, but that doesn't mean we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. What's the backhaul look like? What kind of stuff is being done in between cell towers. Those are the things that are still a little bit arcane and hidden. As I mentioned, there's an increase of risk associated with data transfers and poorly configured Internet of Things devices like webcams that will certainly emerge due to 5G. And then I would say from a backdoor concern, most of these solutions are Chinese deployed and Chinese developed, and we have seen some well-publicized examples of Huawei and others selling equipment that can enable surveillance or kill switch. I know the U.S. government is very, very concerned about this. If your entire infrastructure is built on, say Huawei technology, what's to keep them if you ever had some kind of international incident or war from just pulling the plug and just saying, we're going to kill switch all of your wireless capability. So these are the things that I wonder about. From a security standpoint, inherently to the standard, it does bring over a lot of the 4G stuff, but it also adds something called network slicing, which is, if you remember, we were talking about zero trust in the beginning in micro segmentation. This is along the lines of that. Each slice can be customized with its own protection mechanisms. Another thing would be some new encryption integrity protocols. Back in the earliest days of 2G, and then in the early days of 3G, the encryption was easily broken, and the integrity protection was easily broken. Now we're using things like the advanced encryption standard, which should theoretically be more difficult for hackers to break. All right, I'm going to speed up here because I think I don't want to run out of time and leave a couple of minutes at the end for questions. Another emerging issue in the Threatscape is artificial intelligence. So what is AI? I think we know from watching the movies and reading about it that it's machines that can mimic human capability for thought, right? Learning from examples, recognizing things, making decisions, solving problems, and then applying those things to to do human functions, for example, driving a car, diagnosing cancer, whatever. In the case of security, we see these capabilities as a force multiplier for our security analysts to be able to detect threats. But the question is, are these being used by attackers to detect vulnerabilities that they can easily exploit? That's the hype right now. Hey, you have to have an AI cybersecurity system in order to combat the AI cybersecurity of our adversaries. But I don't think we're quite there yet, actually. Is there really any evidence of our adversary, Russian ransomware groups or the Chinese or any of these APT groups using AI in the wild? Not necessarily. But they are, I'm sure it could be coming. I'm not going to say it's not out there. I just don't think we have seen that next generation, machine learning capability being used by attackers as yet. The federal government started thinking about this a few years ago. The Department of Defense has DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, and they had a cyber grand challenge a few years back, I think in 2016. The very conference I was talking about earlier out in Vegas, where they invited these teams to have autonomous computers attack and defend each other. And they were given these challenges to see how well the computers could both recognize and exploit vulnerabilities, but also come up with self-healing networks and patch against the vulnerabilities when they detected that they were getting attacked in a certain way. So it was just fascinating. I was actually out there at the conference and saw this competition. It was really exciting, and the team from Carnegie Mellon ended up winning. Their system was called Mayhem, and they actually put that system up against human capture the flag teams in the finals of the DEF CON capture the flag competition. Now Mayhem finished in dead last place, so humans are still better right now for a while. But just like there's probably no human that can beat a chess program anymore, right? Gary Kasparov, I think, lost to a chess program, and we're probably going to see the day soon where these systems will be able to, think creatively, think faster. They're very good at solving like low-hanging fruit, easy to exploit things, but they're they're deficient when it comes to really complex problems, timing issues, layers of attack, things like that. And the final word on that is there is a book out there called Tribe of Hackers. You can get a copy of it. I think it's freely available online, or it's on Amazon also. It's a lot of interviews with cybersecurity experts from the industry. And I think when I read through there and I see the questions about AI, machine learning, most people say the same thing. Good security comes from good security folks, from people, not a shiny box that does stuff, right? So in my case, we're talking about XDR and SIM and some of these solutions we were describing earlier. The way I see them being super useful is, for example, user behavioral analytics. So if I knew, for example, Liz logged on to her Office account, Office 365 every day from 8 to 5 from Chatham, and then I saw her logging on at 2 a.m. from Beijing, well, that would be an anomalous login that needs to be, investigated. Now, were I to have to manually set up the rules to check on that, that would be difficult. But the fact is, most of these tools will be able to sit there and listen to the network and understand the environment and see the steady state of the environment, so that they know if there's an outlier or there's a perturbation of the steady state that has to be investigated. So that's a good example of how machine learning might be useful as a force multiplier for analysts. All right, so what can we do about all this stuff? These are the basics any organization should have in place. You got to have some kind of plan. You have to be able to assess where you stand and fill the gaps. You have to establish what I was talking about earlier with continuous monitoring. And then lastly, I would say train people to be aware and be the first line of defense. When I talk about having a formalized program of security, it really has to start with executive leadership. If this is just a grassroots effort of the IT department, it's not going to happen, right? Because let's face it, the people at the top are the ones with the money. And sometimes it's going to take money to make this happen, right? You're going to have to invest. You're going to need to develop a roadmap with milestones and resources and work against that plan. You should have, a regular plan for assessing the vulnerability of your organization, security patching, acceptable use for people using this system, incident response policy. If something does happen, how are we going to respond? How are we going to stay focused, or how are we going to recover from that, as well as a business continuity and disaster recovery plan. Assessments are super important from both. You can do what's called a blue teaming assessment, where you're checking your environment against a list of best practices and seeing where you come up short and then addressing those things. You can also do what's called a red teaming approach. This is where you have an ethical hacking team come in from the outside, as would attackers, except this time, they're going to try to exploit your system, show you the flaws and how to fix them. You should really, do that on an annual basis, or, perhaps more often. Every day, every week, as we mentioned, there's some new thing hitting out there, even if it's, something you trusted software like the SolarWinds attack, or if it's a ransomware of the day, or Log4j, as we mentioned. Assumption of breach is a new normal. How quickly can you detect these attacks, these 0-day attacks? How quickly can you recover and fix the flaw so it can't happen again? You have to have SIMSOC. You have to have security information event management with security operations center 24/7 watching and responding, or else you don't really have anything, honestly. I've seen it before. We helped a small manufacturing firm, $50 million a year, dig out of a ransomware situation where they were completely shut down. They couldn't ship product. They couldn't receive payments. They had lost their financials going back something like 3 years, and they had to pay the ransom to the ransomware group. The cleanup costs for that were around $750,000. If they had, continuous monitoring incident response capability in place, they would have been able to stop that, and it would have not turned into an expensive data breach. And what about, can we look at stuff that's in the cloud? Absolutely. Not only on-premises stuff, but cloud, software as a service, anywhere. We can see all that stuff now, which is important because going back to the first slide, we're all outside the perimeter now. We're all in the cloud. Finally, people need to be educated. Not only can people subvert security controls you have in place, like I can put in a firewall, endpoint protection, all kinds of other things. I can't keep people from getting on the phone with a hacker and being, hey, can you give me your password? Sometimes they'll do it, right? Because the person will do what's called pretexting. They'll call them up, they'll pretend like they're from the IT department, and they'll ask them, hey, we're going to change out your software. I need your password so I can change it out, or whatever. People want to help people, and so we don't like confrontation, we don't like conflict, we don't want to turn anybody down. So a lot of times we fall victim to these social engineering threats. But training, education, awareness are those key. We've shown that through training we can reduce the susceptibility from an initial untrained workforce from about 25 to 30% down to 2 to 3%. Now notice I didn't say 0% because people always make mistakes, but at least we can get some level of progress on that. And that's what we're always trying to do, get better all the time. Well, that was a lot of data drinking from the fire hose, but it was my pleasure to be with you tonight, and it will be my pleasure to answer anything you guys want to throw my way.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was a fabulous presentation. If you want to stop sharing, that would be great.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no trouble. It was very enlightening. I think it's incredible how sophisticated this whole environment is. And I guess you have to keep changing what you're doing in response to the sophistication that is occurring with the black hat hackers.
Right.
So just a reminder to our audience that put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we actually already have some questions are popping up. So we'll go ahead and address those. We have a question from Robert, and he says, are you able to comment on the PK4 hacking into the North Korean internet? So hopefully that makes some sense to you.
Yep, I'm not able to comment on that. Here's a question. So I guess I'm going to open up Robert's question to a broader question, which is, can we hack back? Are we able to hack back? So say I'm actually going to I'm going to address Ed Moxon's question about, are bad guys ever caught and punished? So the answer is usually no, right? Because a lot of these attacks are coming in from other countries where we don't have any reciprocity. We don't have any extradition in place with where these attacks are coming in from. So a lot of times we're not going to bring the people to justice. So the question is, should companies be allowed to hack back? And right now, the answer from the federal government is really no, because think about this. I guess a lot of times there's intermediate systems involved in staging an attack where they don't want to be the attacker doesn't want to be traced back to their home environment, so they'll go and compromise somebody first, and then they'll use that compromise system as a means to attack you. So you could think that the attack is coming from somewhere that it's really not, but it's coming through a proxy. So if you hacked back, you might be actually double victimizing somebody who was just the staging site for the attack on you. So there's different types of people that are authorized to do basically to hack back. If you look this up, and I don't know if you're in the government or not, but Title 10 and Title 50, there's military capability to be able to hack back into our adversary systems. There's also, for intelligence reasons, NSA, CIA, and so forth would be, for national security reasons, be able to hack. But the rest of us, we're not authorized to do that unless somebody is paying you and you have a signed agreement, then you're able to do it. But future state is they're talking about opening up the laws to allow hacking back. But in particular, I saw another story the other day in the newspaper that said that the trains going through Belarus were shut down because somebody had hacked into them, I guess, to try to slow down the progress of I say Soviets, but the former Soviets, the Russians amassing in the Ukrainian border. So it'd be interesting to know if that was something that either the U.S. government or the Ukrainians or one of our allies did to try to slow down the troop movements. I'm also going to answer, is cloud technology the best solution for the everyday user? I think so. Think, what is the cloud exactly? It's just somebody else's computer, but it's somebody else's computer that's well run, right? A lot of times our own infrastructure is, it's lacking patches, it's lacking the proper configuration. The cloud is not 100%, secure, but the infrastructure is secure, theoretically. So if AWS or Microsoft are providing that infrastructure, they're going to it's going to be a shared security responsibility. So that the network level is abstracted to the user, so that we can assume that's pretty secure. But what you put on the infrastructure, that's your responsibility for locking it down. There's still a lot of security hardening that needs to be done. So I'd say in general, yes to the cloud, but caveat that with saying it doesn't solve all your problems. You still have some of the responsibility yourself. And I'll do one more question. How do you keep
there's one from
executive?
Joe. Yep, you see that
Yep.
one. Yeah.
How do you keep executive management focused, especially in small companies? They always seem to be onto something more important to commit resources, especially employee time, breaking habits, etc. Really hard. Okay, so this is Joe. This is what I do all the time. Is educate executive leadership on these issues. There's a number of things that are driving this now. We used to use FUD, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Oh, if you don't do this, you're going to get hacked and you're going to lose money. And I could certainly show you, a quantitative return on investment for your cybersecurity spend versus the exposure you would have, and the lost productivity and damaging losses from a ransomware attack or some other cyber breach. But the fact is, there's more to it these days. The things we drive at now are more like from a compliance standpoint. If you're in business and you're sharing information with another business, you're probably going to have to fill out a security questionnaire for your business partner, saying that you have due diligence in place. There's supply chain pressures now. There's also regulatory pressures, as I mentioned before. There's privacy considerations. California, New York, 17 other states have pending privacy legislation. If you're doing any work in Europe, they have GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation. So they're saying you need to protect people's private data now, and there's a cybersecurity component that goes along with that. So it's not just about not getting hacked. It's also about complying with regulations and complying with best practices and ensuring that your supply chain is protected. So it's just kind of the new normal. So I think if you give me a chance to talk to these people, maybe I can talk some sense into them. But you definitely, it is the right thing to do. It's a regular part of running a business now. The new normal is you have to have cybersecurity throughout the organization. It can't just be an afterthought, or like I mentioned, it can't just be a grassroots effort of the IT department. It has to be from the top down. All right. So my pleasure being with you here tonight, and I'll send it back over to Liz.
Thank you, Jeremy. We really appreciate your time. Again, it was a great presentation. So in appreciation, we will be sending you a Chatham Marconi hat that you can wear
I love
down
hats.
in Tampa. And then you're going to become a member of the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center, and we'll get that off to you. So certainly you can visit if you ever come north. We would love to see you. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to thank our audience tonight too for participating with the questions, as well as for supporting Chatham Marconi. Our next speaker is on March 3rd. It's Dr. Joshua Levy from the Library of Congress, and he'll highlight collection items that shed light on Samuel Morse and his code. So looking forward to seeing you, and thank you and good night.